So I feel like I could have just joined the last panel. They touched on like 10 or 15 different things that we probably could spend an hour on, and I'll probably pick up on a couple of the themes that they covered as well. I want to start with first just touching on, the last panel talked a little bit about strategy and developing a strategy and having a cyber strategy. So a little over a year ago, we put out the first national cyber strategy that we'd had in 15 years. And that was a very collaborative, very done by a group of interagency folks to develop that strategy and get it out there. Could have just joined the last panel. They touched on like 10 or 15 different things that we probably could spend an hour on, and I'll probably pick up on a couple of the themes that they covered as well. I want to start with first just touching on, the last panel talked a little bit about strategy and developing a strategy and having a cyber strategy. So a little over a year ago, we put out the first national cyber strategy that we'd had in 15 years. And that was a very collaborative, very done by a group of interagency folks to develop that strategy and get it out the door. And the strategy is organized around the same four pillars of the national security strategy. And I'm going to touch on the strategy and then go a little deeper into federal cybersecurity and some of the nuts and bolts of what we're doing from the federal space. So pillar one of the national cyber strategy is to protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life. So a little bit of mom and apple pie, but really the core of what we need to do as a nation. And there's three key elements under that strategy. And the strategy writ large, if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read the strategy. It's about 24 pages. It's pretty accessible. You will not find the solution to our cybersecurity challenges necessarily in there. What you will find are 42 different priority actions, and I'll talk a bit on kind of what we're doing to implement those 42 priority actions. But under pillar one, three main focus areas. First and foremost, federal cybersecurity. So much of the focus for this and much of what I will talk about, what are we doing to protect the federal government, the systems, the data that we hold and operate on behalf of the American people. Second, critical infrastructure. So critical infrastructure, talked a little bit in the last panel about critical infrastructure, owned and operated, the vast majority of it, by private industry. So really, what should we and can we do from a federal standpoint to bring national capabilities and assets to bear to help protect our critical infrastructure, without which our personal lives rapidly come to a halt, and our professional lives definitely come to a halt if we don't have the financial systems and electricity and water and transportation and a lot of the other things in that sector. And then the third area under the first pillar is combating cyber crime. Cyber criminal activity is still the majority of malicious activity on the internet today. Not as sexy and as exciting as nation-state activity, but certainly the majority of activity, and will continue to be that way, right? As long as criminals can find a way to monetize malicious activity on the internet, and we're going to keep using the internet and doing business on the internet going forward, they're going to try to find ways to have fraud and to make money, whether it's ransomware or just plain theft and sort of other avenues. Pillar two is promoting American prosperity. So how do we maintain the internet as the open, safe, and secure engine of economic and innovative growth that it's been for the last certainly 2, probably 3 decades, and we want to continue to see that, right? This is the place in the digital world where our innovation is taking place in this country to a large degree, and certainly where a lot of our economic growth is happening. And we want to be sure that the internet continues to be a place where that can happen and where American companies can prosper. Pillar three is preserving peace through strength. This starts to get into some of our international work in cybersecurity, but also our offensive work in cybersecurity. And so really, to me, it's about how do we view cyber as an element of national power. Right? We have lots of different elements of national power. We have the Department of Defense. We have the Department of State and Diplomacy. We can do kinetic activities through the Department of Defense. Cyber is just another tool, and it's a tool to achieve the national ends that we're trying to get at, as opposed to using cyber just as a response to a cyber hack. So we don't necessarily need to fight cyber with cyber. We just need to view it as one of the many tools. And if you look in the strategy, we explicitly say all elements of national power we view are available to respond to cyber activity. So again, we're not in this one domain world. We're in a very multi-domain world. And then Pillar 4 is advancing American influence. So how do we work with like-minded countries around the world to ensure that they are taking steps to protect the internet, to protect their systems, and working with us collectively. So from a federal standpoint, as the Federal Chief Information Security Officer, we implement the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014, cybersecurity requirements, FISMA 2014. And the OMB director has a number of responsibilities for the federal civilian agencies in that space or in that law. It boils down to kind of three things, and this is what I do on behalf of the director. First is develop and oversee the implementation of cybersecurity policies. So develop policies, help tell agencies what they need to be doing, and do that in a way that provides enough flexibility for the diversity of cross-federal agencies, some of which are very, very small, and some of which, of course, are very large, and yet has enough specificity that agencies aren't lacking in what they need to actually go do. So, and then working very closely with agencies, we partner very, very closely with the Department of Homeland Security on the adoption of those policies. So our agencies actually implementing them so that when Nick from the General GAO office comes and does his audit, he can see that agencies are actually doing well and improving going forward. So we partner very closely with DHS on that. The second item under FISMA is ensuring that agencies are protecting information commensurate with the risk of harm from a compromise. Risk management is what that boils down to, right? That was talked about a lot on the previous panel as well, of we have to be managing risk. That's what this is about. You can't protect everything. If you try to protect everything, you're either going to spend an infinite amount of money that doesn't exist, as Tom talked about, or you are just going to end up watering everything down and not protecting anything. So we have a high-value asset program. It's a policy that OMB put out. It's a program office inside the Department of Homeland Security, inside of CISA, and it is focused on agencies identifying what are their highest value assets within their agencies, and then what are the ones that we think actually bubble up across government, and the ones that are either have interdependencies or just come to the top across government. And then we work with DHS so that DHS is doing essentially a third-party assessment, right? Agencies should always be doing assessments of their highest priority items, but DHS is coming in and doing assessments. And we've done this for years. We do lots of assessments. The critical part of the high-value asset program is then tracking the implementation of mitigations, because all too often in the past, we would do an assessment, the team would go away, they would give the owner of the system, here's all the things you should do, they'd go away, they'd come back 18 months or 2 years later, they would do another assessment, and the mitigation recommendations is almost the same book, right? So it's really about that follow-through. It is about making sure that we're actually updating patches, that we're implementing the strong authentication, that we're doing the things that come through, that we're segmenting our networks, that we're making it so that when an adversary gets in, and adversaries are going to get in, that we're able to detect that, and that we're able to stop the malicious activity as quickly as possible. So really understanding what's most critical. And then third is around compliance, but it's ensuring that agencies are complying with all federal requirements for information security. So these could be legislation, laws, it could be memorandums that come from the Office of Management and Budget that we put out our policies, it could be binding operational directives from the Department of Homeland Security, or they could be items from NIST, from National Institute of Standards and Technologies, their special publications and guidance on what agencies need to be doing. And while compliance often gets poo-pooed as we need to focus on security and not compliance, part of the checklist approach of compliance, I feel, is still really, really valuable, right? When you're waiting to get on an airplane and the pilot's walking around just going through a checklist, I feel better about that, because at least he did go walk around the airplane and check the 20 things on the checklist. And if you can boil it down to a checklist, It's simpler to implement, and we might as well do that. What we need to stay away from are compliance activities that don't actually add any security value. And so we are always trying to balance and move and ensure that what we're asking agencies to do is focused on security. So one of the big priorities that I want to touch on for a couple of minutes and then leave a few minutes for questions is supply chain. I know the last two groups talked a bit about supply chain. Supply chain is one of the things that keeps me up at night. It is getting harder and harder in our global economy to understand the provenance of the equipment, the hardware, the software, as well as the services of the individuals and the companies that you're doing business with. If you open up a box, where all that equipment came from. If you open a Huawei box, most of the equipment inside of it came from the United States or was designed in the United States at the very least, right? We certainly have concerns about Huawei, but you need to understand both what's inside the box, who built it, what was their intent, and then what potentially could a nation-state actor who can have control, exert lawful control, not rule of law that we might recognize in our country, but lawful in their country, rule over that manufacturer or that developer. So a year ago, the president signed the Secure Technologies Act. The Secure Technologies Act, he signed it on December 21st last year, the day of the government shutdown, didn't get a lot of press. It created the Federal Acquisition Security Council. The Federal Acquisition Security Council is housed inside the Office of Management and Budget. I'm the chair of the council. We have representatives from the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, General Services Administration, and the Director of National Intelligence, as well as OMB, to include the acquisition side of OMB. And the council is charged to do a couple things. One is we're charged to figure out what are the requirements for federal agencies for having a supply chain risk management program. Agencies, the law says all agencies need to have a program. We need to help give them guidance about what that program will consist of and how they can implement that program, a bit of what are the requirements. Secondly is we need to figure out what information we need to collect and what information we need to share around supply chain and risk management and where we want to have that information shared from. So we are in the process of identifying who the information sharing executive agent's going to be, what the team's going to look like and be composed of that's going to work with that executive agent so that we can figure out how are we collecting information from across agencies, sharing information back out with agencies, but also sharing information with the private sector as well. Because one of the things I'm certain of is that lots of agencies, perhaps more in the intelligence community, somewhere in a contracting officer's bottom desk drawers is some piece of paper that says, I'm not going to buy equipment from XYZ company. And for whatever set of reasons that may be classified, they may be open source. It could be because there was a national defense authorization, a law that told me I can't buy Huawei and ZTE and others. But there's a lot of that, I think, ongoing. We need to collect all that information in one place so that we have a good insight. Because if an agency decides not to buy something for really good reasons, well, then we want to be sure that we understand those reasons and we know what risk we're possibly accepting elsewhere in the enterprise. So information sharing is a really big part of it. Also, shared services. So identifying what supply chain risk management shared services we should look to implement because we have agencies that, the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security that may have lots of resources and ability to do supply chain risk management. We've got a lot of small agencies that are never going to have those capabilities. So can we move towards more of a shared service in some way, shape, and form? And then the last big item is the council is charged with making recommendations to either the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, or the Director of National Intelligence on what's called removal and exclusion orders. And so the council is charged to figure out what products to do assessments of, what goods, what products, what services, what companies to do assessments, and then we can make recommendations to those three individuals who have authorities under the law, and this is really what we needed the legislation for. A lot of the things I already talked about we could have done without legislation, we could have done with executive action, but we needed legislation. They can then issue removal and exclusion orders and say, for my my enterprise, be it the intelligence community, the Defense Department, or the rest of the federal civilian agencies with DHS, this product poses as unacceptable risk to the enterprise, and therefore you need to pull all of them out of the environment and throw them away, or you can't buy them. We would rather tell people not to buy stuff than have to rip out things that we've already bought. So we're going to focus there. But that is really a significant capability that we have to, from an enterprise standpoint, look at goods and services. Also, as part of this, we are confident, and the Director of National Intelligence, more importantly, is confident that we can leverage classified information for these removal and exclusion orders or for the recommendations. And so when DHS 2 years ago issued a binding operational directive about Kaspersky, labs equipment in the federal space, that was based completely on open source information because we knew we'd have to turn all our rationale over during discovery and the legal battles that continue to be ongoing in that. And similarly, we wanted to have protection. So there are still rule of law challenges to the removal and exclusion orders that can be made, but we feel that we're going to be able to protect classified information with that going forward. So I'm going to stop there because I have about 2 more minutes. I want to keep you guys on time going forward, but I really wanted to focus on the supply chain risk management aspect of what we're doing and take a couple questions if possible. Sir? You can I can repeat it if.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing your insight. I'm a reporter from Voice of America Korean Service. I was just wondering, could you address some concern on specifically North Korean cyber threats? And also, as you may know, that Japan, you also mentioned about working with like-minded country. And I know that United States and Japan is really closely working on cyber threats, on information sharing. I was just wondering, like South Korea is now have to decide whether to extend GSOMIA, information sharing with Japan. Do you have any concern on specifically cyber domain of South Korea not extending information sharing with Japan? Thank you.
So I don't have enough knowledge on South Korea and Japan's information sharing agreement. I certainly think information sharing is really important in this space. North Korea continues to pose a significant cyber challenge. They've become more and more brazen. I don't think they're an existential threat to us in any way, shape, or form right now. However, they are certainly gaining in capability, increasing in capacity, both from what we would think of as more traditional espionage, but also just cyber crime, right? They're trying to help fund the regime through malicious cyber activity. So they certainly continue to be a risk. And yes, we have to work together with like-minded countries to be able to combat the malicious actors that are out there. I think we have time for one more.
In the largest sector of the U.S. economy, healthcare, how do you view threats, vulnerabilities, and threats with the Internet of Medical Things?
Yeah, I think the Internet of Things in general increases the threat surface significantly. It makes our adversaries' challenges easier. We give them more places. I think healthcare is one that was slow to the game. I'm not an expert in this space, but certainly from my perception has been kind of slow to the game, and yet is now making strides. Like I think they have recognized as a sector, hey, this really is of significant risk to us. Cyber is an existential threat to our industry, maybe not to the industry, but certainly to individual companies if they have challenges there. And I think, and this is something that we all need to do, is how do we create market incentives that are going to drive better cybersecurity behavior, both from companies that we're getting services from, so that they're demanding, but also from manufacturers, right? The Internet of Things, we keep buying crappy web cameras with no password and can never be patched because it's the cheapest one to watch our dog while we're at work. Well, we also connected it to our entire digital life and perhaps our tax returns and all the pictures of our kids when we plugged it into our network at home. And so we've all got to be better at being more demanding and be able to create that market incentive, because I don't think it exists on itself, and it certainly doesn't exist if we don't look at cybersecurity as a discriminator with how we actually spend our dollars. So we're out of time. Thank you very much for your time and your focus on cybersecurity.